neither of us could have thought at that time that there would be this incredible flowering of work, discussion, this kind of creative working on concepts that you've just heard, the dialogue here. So really, Melanie, a big thanks to you for the intellectual dynamism and dedication and just dialogic creativity that's kind of brought us all to this place. And let's just go on together. So on that note, I want to go into some of the terrain that Joan started to map today. And what this paper is about is also that double-sidedness of education. I know it's come up a lot in the questions people have asked as well. It's the question about how education is both reproductive and transformative, has the potential to be transformative of inequalities, and how do we, and injustice. And a key, I think, challenge in understanding these processes and developing some of the theoretical nuance and empirical refinement of both those facets, the reproduction of inequalities and the transformational element, and their connections, that relationality that Joan was referring to, and their disjunctures. I think all of that, we have resources in the capability approach to try and do that. And what I'm going to try to do in this paper is draw on some of the perspective from the capability approach, but I'm going to introduce a new kind of wild card of ideas to you, the idea of negative capability. This paper has got 3 strands of discussion, and I'm going to explore it firstly by introducing you to what negative capability is and some of the different ways that negative capability has been used. And I'm also going to look at some aspects of negative method. I also am going to present to you some elements of a kind of quite sprawling project I'm involved in, looking at island prisons. And South Africans are very well aware of Robben Island as a prison in which a formidable education project was developed that had enormous significance for the history of the struggle against apartheid and the post-apartheid state. But I've been astonished to find now 5, possibly 7 other island prison projects of people around the world who've engaged in education processes. And I'm going to draw out some of the similarities and contrasts and talk about what island prisons tell us about education as a site of hope and this process of and the island, as people are aware of, is often a place that you play with ideas about political philosophy, imagined futures. So what can thinking about the island, and maybe that school you were showing us, the so atypical school was a kind of island. And thinking about hope, theorizing hope, in relation to some issues that can raise for the capability approach. Okay, the idea of negative capability first emerges as a fragment. It's been enormously influential in literary studies, in psychoanalysis, and actually the whole school of Romanticism almost rests on this tiny fragment of a letter that John Keats wrote to his brother in 1817. And what he wrote is that he's talking about how one thinks. And he says, "It struck me that quality went to form a man of achievement, especially in literature, and which Shakespeare possessed so enormously." So he's thinking of the quality of Shakespeare's plays. And he calls this, negative capability. That is when man is capable of being in uncertainties, mysteries, doubts, without any irritable reaching after facts and reason. So this notion that something we don't know can be as powerful and creative as the detail of what we know has been very, very generative of whole areas of work that have considerable significance and influence, and yet it's not been that used in work on the capability approach, and I want to talk about that and what some of its potential might be. In doing it, I want to think about the idea of negative. And there are three meanings, I think, of negative. The first is that things can be unjust, oppressive, unpleasant. And a number of people, and I think Timmy even asked a question this morning about learning language. It's a negative capability. If you don't speak English, you are looked down on. So there are unjust treatments of people. And so we can have capabilities that are just straight unjust. Your experience, education, you hope it will bring you something, but it brings you unpleasant experiences. The second meaning of negative that I've worked with is the idea that negative is to say no. But what one says no, and how one says no, and why one says no is highly contextual. So it's very different to say no, you cannot have black students in your class. It is a very different saying no to racism, no to sexism, and saying no in a way that is quite quiet, and you only say no to you say no to injustice. You live under a very oppressive regime, and you can only say no in very small signifiers or symbols. That is very different to saying no as a huge political movement where you have powerful forces linked together. So there are ways of saying no that are highly contextual, and we need to understand the context in order to understand the negative. And the third way is what's formulated in art and music and is referred to as negative space and negative sound. I'm just going to show you this sculpture by the sculptor Barbara Hepworth. So they refer to negative space as the empty space in the middle. But you read that empty space because of the shapes around it. And if people know John Cage's music, which is 4 minutes, this many, and it's completely silent. And in that time, you hear other things. You hear your own thoughts. You hear what it is. So negative sound, it's not empty sound, but the people round about it make the shape. So those are three meanings of negative that I'm going to link to ways of thinking about negative capability. I've given you these examples. Actually, this is negative capabilities, highly constrained capability sets, tragic processes of being forced to distinguish or choose between equally valued capabilities or not realized valued functionings. The negative is say no tends to stress agency. And this, the work of around negative capability, this form of saying no, has actually been used by a Brazilian writer, Roberto Anga, who's written a whole book on negative capability. But he uses the concept as a form of critique of existing politics and arrangements and institutions. And it's a critique of Marxist theorization. So it's saying no, and saying no to the excessive delineation of structures and particular formulations and structures. And I can talk a bit more about his work if people want. The third version of negative space is classically associated with the work of education of John Dewey, who wrote this very influential book in 1934 about art education. And he quoted Keats. But what was so important about Dewey's use of the idea of negative capability is that art education, which had been the province of a canon of high art, in Dewey saying negative capability, we need to look at everyday experience. had this enormous influence on saying art is what children make, we must bring art into the classroom, art is a much more democratic kind of process, and that links to other processes about child-centered learning. So the kind of quite abstract formulation of Dewey's work in the 1930s through the 1950s and 1960s had enormous influence in the States and in Europe on particular ideas about education and challenges to canonical education. There's another set of ways in which the negative have been used, and I'm calling these negative methods. So they're not actually the concept of negative capability, but I think there's potential in thinking of negative method. So the first is Adorno's use of the idea of negative dialectics, and I was very struck when I went back to look at Adorno's work on negative dialectics of the way in which he pulled out the significance of suffering. So basically what Adorno is saying is that the Marxist dialectic, that there's either the bourgeoisie or the proletariat, for example, gives you no way of understanding fascism in Germany. The kind of suffering that is inflicted on Germany, on the German people, later on the rest of the world, it exceeds that dialectical division. You need something else, and that's the negative dialectics. It brings in, it illuminates unscripted relationships amongst established concepts, rearranging them in constellations. And this allows us to escape the classifications imposed on them. Miranda Fricker, who's written, and I know Melanie's written really interestingly about her work on epistemic injustice in relation to decolonization and public good in South Africa. Miranda Fricker also uses a different kind of negative method. She says, let's look at failure first in order that we can understand epistemic injustice. So that we need to know what this kind of injustice looks like in order to answer the question of justice. It's a bit like the dialogue that was going on between the two of you. What does injustice look like and what does justice look like? And she wants to say what might frustrate the capability to make an epistemic contribution. If we look at what are the deliberate blocks, what forms of testimony, and these testimonial injustice or hermeneutic injustice might exist. And if we note the forms of injustice, we might be able to know what justice and capabilities are. So our method is to catalogue injustice, because that then allows us to think about justice. Social scientists do a much more neat-seeming version of negative method, where they look at counterfactuals, or they want to say, if we look at a counterfactual history, how might we see the relations of causation? So the negative, when you look at what's not there, it allows you to see more clearly what is there. And what I want to think about, although I haven't yet done it, and maybe it's something people here could question and run with, is decoloniality as a form of negative method. So that there are elements of thinking beyond, outside, and that's a form of negative method that is full of potential. So those are the kind of ideas I'm working with. And these are some questions about negative capability, which I'm now not going to talk about very much. I'm more interested in the connections between all those elements of negative capability and those forms of negative method, and what they can illuminate for us about how education might work as a site of hope, and how does hope, agency, and well-being relate. So to do this, I want to just introduce you to the work on, how am I doing for time?
No, you're
I'm okay. On these 4 island prisons. And I think, these are real islands, and these are real writings by real groups of prisoners and real education projects. But I think what's interesting about them is that they also present utopias, forms, maybe forms of thinking with negative method. Okay, these are the 4 islands that I'm going to talk about. The top one is Robben Island. The second one is the island of Ustica in Italy, and the third one is New Caledonia, and the fourth one is Buru Island, which is a prison island in Indonesia. These are the 4 people's works I've been drawing on, and they're collections of works that were their political reflections, diaries, novels, poetry. They were written by these 4 people who were political prisoners on these islands. But as I'm going to talk about them, you are going to see, and it's very resonant with Pablo's work, that they are not the products only of a single individual. The fact that we even have them are testaments to enormous acts of friendship and hope and relationship that produce these texts that I've been drawing on and developing the ideas of prison islands and education and hope. So the 4 people are, I talk about them in the historical sequence of which their writings relate. Louise Michel was a French anarchist. She was a leader of the Paris Commune at the end of the 18th century. The 19th century, 1871. She was one of the leader of the Women's Committee of the Paris Commune, and she was arrested, held for a long time under terrible conditions. The Paris Commune was put down very, very brutally. And then she was transported with about 20 women and 80 men to the island of New Caledonia in the South Pacific. So she's the first one. The second is Antonio Gramsci, who was a leader of the Italian Communist Party.